From ImpactAlpha, it's This Week in Impact, where we bring you some of the most interesting impact investing stories of the week. It's Friday, July 4th. Happy Independence Day to all who celebrate. I'm Brian Walsh, and I'm joined this week by ImpactAlpha editor David Bank. We'll discuss doing more with less, the blended finance fallout from shrinking aid and a shuttered USAID. Plus, a call for European and responsible investors to invest in defense companies. And finally, remembering B-Lab co-founder Andrew Kassoy, an agent of impact who launched a movement to align capital with purpose. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, David. Happy 4th of July to you. How are you celebrating on this long weekend?
Well, we've rechristened it Interdependence Day, Brian. So we're celebrating interdependence.
Interdependence, so the connection that we all have to one another.
Indeed.
All right. Well, first up, let's turn to emerging markets. As our Jessica Pothering reported this week, 2025 may be recorded as the year the private sector has taken over development finance. That's at least according to participants at the 4th Annual International Conference on Financing for Development, or FFD4, which concluded this week in Seville, Spain. But the private sector stepping up may be because the public sector has stepped back. As Jessica noted, overseas development assistance commitments from wealthy countries to low and lower middle income countries were down 7% from 2023 to 2024. And that was before the U.S. abruptly shuttered its nearly $40 billion in annual spending from the U.S. Agency for International Development. We had a ghost post this week from the CEO of the blended finance tracking and boosting nonprofit Convergence, which argued that amid the seismic shift in the global aid architecture, the decline in overseas development assistance may provide the jolt the blended finance market needs to professionalize and scale. So, David, how might we do more with less?
Well, one of the things that I thought was interesting in Joan Laria's report from Convergence was that the private sector commitment between 23 and 24 was pretty stable, about $7 billion in both cases. So the as you say, it's not the private sector taking over. I mean, if only it would. It's mostly that the public sector is starting to take a step back, as you say. And so, the question is, what can fill this gap? And it's not going to be any one thing. I mean, philanthropy, development finance institutions, private investors, none of them are going to fill the gap of, government donor grants. But the question is, is there a market opportunity now for more capital to flow into kinds of things that used to be considered only kind of concessional or donor driven? And I think the answer is yes. And that comes with a big asterisk, which is the ones that will get financed in this new world are going to be the ones that are more bankable, more investable in the first place. And the true humanitarian needs that USAID addressed, those are not going to be things that the private sector is likely to take up. So there's going to be a new architecture of global development, a new architecture of global aid. I think blended finance will take a bigger role. But the question is, how do we actually address, the humanitarian needs, the emergency needs, the hunger and poverty that still afflicts many countries in many regions. And I don't think anybody at that Seville conference had an answer to that yet.
So every dollar going to blended finance deals will require closer scrutiny. So that means that we need to have the best kind of projects lined up and ready to attract that private capital.
Yeah. I mean, there's been an interesting discussion going on, and it's one of these things that's kind of spoken in kind of hushed tones because it has some interesting implications, which is, some of the concessional financing, the aid financing and other things that were going in, had the effect of either crowding out or just like over subsidizing, maybe low, in the case of low cost debt. And now that those funders, public funders, have pulled back, some private investors are saying, hey, now we can get, actually paid for our capital, paid for our risk in a sort of market-based way. And that makes it actually more interesting for us to go into places that we hadn't gone into before because we're not facing competition from low cost subsidized capital. And of course, people don't really quite want to say that out loud because it sort of suggests that the government money wasn't needed. And as I say, in many cases, the government money certainly was needed. But there is kind of the beginnings of stirrings of a kind of new conception of how kind of global development can get financed.
Right. And I think it's important to kind of clarify the kind of different buckets of overseas development assistance we're talking about. So, on the one hand, there's, as you said, the humanitarian aid that doesn't have a business model attached to it. It's just that money needs to go to support people in communities who are in desperate need. And the other bucket is supporting overall economic development in those kind of regions, in those kind of frontier and emerging markets. And that's where how do you use limited, finite public and philanthropic capital to crowd in commercial private capital. And the concern has long been in the blended finance world that instead of crowding in that capital, that you've been crowding out that capital with these kind of subsidized investments.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right, Brian. And one of the things that's sort of come up in these conversations is private investors don't generally respond to need, and everybody's talking about the need, and the needs are obviously real and glaring. But private capital responds to opportunities, and as you say, in many of these cases, there are, just to be blunt about it, there's money to be made. It's not money to be made on aid or on poverty. It's money to be made on growth and business, and the small business sectors in many emerging markets are very vibrant, very lively, very high growth sectors because they're serving the basic needs, the real needs of growing populations, often of young populations. They have young workforces as well. And so I think the opportunity to aid, as you say, in economic development in many countries is becoming more appealing. And again, that does not mean that the very real needs of folks who are not ever going to produce profit should be neglected. So again, tough questions and sort of sensitive in many ways, but investors are kind of trying to get their heads around the new landscape.
Right. And as Joan made the case in her piece for us, that a durable future for blended finance depends on coordination, scale, and smarter use of scarce concessional dollars. So, where does that coordination and scale and smart use of that limited dollars come into play here?
Well, I think a lot of things are coming together. There's kind of a notion that any given deal, any project developer, any company shouldn't have to go kind of make sense of the bespoke conditions of every different lender. And so there's kind of clearinghouses being set up. Norway and other Scandinavian countries have gotten together, and Convergence itself is convening some of these kinds of gatherings and sort of have one door to go into and say, this is the kind of project that we've got. And then, a coordinated donor effort or a coordinated catalytic capital effort can kind of supply the capital that's needed in a much more streamlined way. And then more broadly, that the deals become a little more cookie cutter, a little more standardized. So there's just less lawyering and paperwork involved in each one. So those kinds of things, again, this whole kind of crisis in aid and development financing is forcing some things that probably were long overdue in any event.
Yeah, and so with limited dollars available, David, also a closer scrutiny comes to how those dollars are being deployed. And Jessica's piece, she touched on that kind of the index around how transparent some of these aid funders are, especially the development finance institutions.
Yeah, that's critical, and particularly the DFIs, as they're called, are being pressured to play a more catalytic role. Previously, they were more or less commercial investors themselves, even though they had a kind of a public mandate and in some cases public backing. But they had a kind of investment policy that was not that distinguishable from a commercial investor. And now they're being pressured to play that catalytic role, as you say, to crowd in private capital. And so the rest of the world wants to know, well, how are they doing at that? And that's a disclosure question, and an outfit called Publish What You Fund, which has been after the DFIs in particular to be more transparent about their operations, gave a ranking and said, not quite so good yet, but maybe getting a little bit better in terms of being open and visible and good disclosure practices about where all that money is going.
All right. Well, you can read Jessica's piece about development finance institutions, transparency, and Joan's guest post about blended finance on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. For now, let's take a quick break. When we come back, making the case for European responsible investors to invest in defense companies. Defense has dominated global headlines in recent weeks as the world teetered on the brink of World War III breaking out in the Middle East. With the U.S. appearing to be an increasingly unreliable partner, NATO member countries meeting at The Hague officially committed to spending 5% of their GDP on defense, up from an average of 2.6%. As Susan Winterberg and Johannes Lenhard of Venture ESG argue in a guest post this week, these developments have sharpened the debate over whether investments supporting Europe's rearmament are incompatible with principles of sustainable investing and ESG, or whether they're indispensable. So, David, what's at stake here?
Well, Brian, the defense boom underway in Europe is really striking, and it's been going on, really since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But defense is now the fastest growing segment of venture capital in Europe. There's a Rearm Europe plan, a kind of $1 trillion plan to reshore Europe's defense industry. So many startups are kind of angling for some of that money and some of those contracts, and thus funds are forming and doing deals to back companies that can get a piece of that pie. And so one of the questions has been, can those defense investments be considered impact investments or sustainable investments? And in Europe, it's not just a kind of academic parlor game. It's, can they get bank loans in places where those loans are conditioned on meeting certain kinds of ESG or sustainability standards under European regulations? So there's a whole debate going on in Europe over whether to relax those regulations and include defense spending. And, it kind of gets into some kind of maybe Orwellian kinds of debates, like people may recoil at defense spending, but they were all in favor of peace spending. And in fact, Sustainable Development Goal number 16 is, peaceful development and global cooperation kind of things. And one person's national defense is another person's peace strategy.
Right. And without security, the argument goes, there can be no sustainability in the first place. So it's kind of like a fundamental need and requirement for the effective investing in a sustainable future.
One of the ways people have used to try to get around this little conundrum is what's going on by the name of dual use. And these are things that have a military application, but also have a civilian application. And the classic example, of course, is the internet, which was developed in the U.S. as a DARPA defense application, and of course now the world runs on it. But other things, including GPS or drones, have both peaceful and military uses. And so one of the ways people are trying to tap these defense dollars is to show the military applications of these civilian technologies, and then that poses a question for their investors. Is that what they want those companies to be doing?
Yeah, David, so this reminds me of an anecdote from years ago at the Milken Global Conference, where the head of investing for the state of North Carolina made the claim that investing in tobacco is a sustainable investment because in the state of North Carolina, tobacco farmers are a huge industry. So this gets back to that old saw, where you stand on an issue may be dependent on where you sit.
Yeah, and the story that we had in ImpactAlpha got a lot of pushback. Responsible investors should invest in defense. I think really the point was that investors in defense should be responsible, and that in fact we shouldn't leave defense to only war profiteers and merchants of death, but that folks need to get in and start to think about how do you put what are kinds of responsible use mechanisms, where should how should technology be deployed and be thought about, what's inbounds and what's out of bounds, and not just let that be the province of defense defense companies.
Right. So if you can't exclude defense companies from your overall portfolio, how do you incorporate them in a way where you're engaging in active ownership of the companies you own, and that you are trying to push them to be as responsible and sustainable as can be given the category that they operate in?
Yeah. And I don't know that defense spending is going to be going down in any short term, and so trying to steer that that capital stream, just like other capital streams, into a more responsible direction, I think is obviously a worthy task, but it's fraught with peril, as you can imagine.
Absolutely. All right. Well, you can read the Venture ESG guest post on European investing in defense industries on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. And what's your take? Impact Alpha subscribers can weigh in on the debate on our Slack channel that's exclusive for subscribers to Impact Alpha. But for now, let's take one more quick break. When we come back, remembering B Lab's Andrew Kassoy and the movement he helped launch, aligning capital with purpose. After a 2-year battle with cancer, B Lab co-founder Andrew Kassoy passed away last week at the age of 55. Tributes have been pouring in from agents of impact honoring one of their own. David, Andrew is a deep thinker about the system of capitalism and endeavored to shift how that system operates. What changes did he work to bring about?
Yeah, Brian, Andrew was really one of the pioneers and somebody that I looked to when I first got into all this stuff. And I think folks know about the B Lab, B Corp movement, and those are certified companies that meet certain standards for kind of a duty of care to their stakeholders beyond their shareholders. And there's thousands of them. I think something like 8,000 of them around the world. What's interesting to me is that the other part of the strategy that they started out with was for what you could think of as a mechanism for impact exits, and the problem being that companies that start with a social mission, when they get acquired by either by bigger corporations or by private equity companies, that mission often gets lost, and that if you're going to have a whole set of hungry and passionate and idealistic entrepreneurs starting companies across the landscape, you want to make sure that when they grow up into big companies, that mission can be sustained and obviously scaled and even broadened. And so he always had a notion of a kind of impact holding company, the fabled kind of Berkshire Hathaway of impact, that would be able to buy up these B Corps as needed, and possibly then sell them on in a more deliberate way to the right buyers, but a kind of holding company that would be able to give these founders their exits while preserving the mission. And what's interesting is that the last story we did with Andrew before he died was about a new impact holding company, 9Dean, that he helped set up with an investment from the Ford Foundation, built around the thesis of quality jobs, that treating workers better was going to be a value creation mechanism, and that this holding company would then have a portfolio of companies that had an advantage because they treated their workers better. So he, at some level, kind of realized his full strategy, or his full agenda, right at the last moment, on deadline, as it were. We published this week an essay that he wrote 18 years ago today, actually, the Declaration of Interdependence, reconciling profit and purpose, that laid this all out.
Yeah, David, that essay was quite beautiful and quite prescient all these years later, and quite the legacy. Andrew was a gifted speaker as well, and he spoke last year while he still had was battling this illness, back in March of 2024 in Paris at the Change Now conference. And I thought we could end our podcast with Andrew in his own words from his keynote.
It's ironic that in the U.S., where most corporations are incorporated or headquartered in the state of Delaware, the Delaware law actually has a duty of care. But that duty of care is to only one group of people, the shareholders. It's to maximize the company's value for the benefit of the shareholders. And the duty of care for a few is a duty of carelessness for the rest of us. The consequences of that system are pretty obvious, and they're entirely predictable. Business operates outside the donut, outside of human and planetary boundaries, because the rules and the norms of the system, they require it. And because the planet is on fire, people feel left out, sold out. They feel left behind. They're marginalized. And so people are on fire. They're angry. And whether their anger is manifested in activism or whether it's manifested in populism, in many ways they're really saying the same thing. The system isn't meeting my needs, and I'm upset. I don't trust the system. Now, they don't all blame it on business, not explicitly. But I think that if you pull the thread on any of the problems that we're talking about here, whether it's climate change or biodiversity or the degradation of work or the marginalization of workers throughout supply chains, any of these problems, if you just pull the thread on any of them, what you can see at the end of that thread is business, the role of business in society. In other words, we have systems failure. Business is failing to meet the needs of all of us. It is not creating a shared and durable prosperity for all. So the question is, how do we change that system?
Again, that was Andrew Kassoy, who passed away last week at the age of 55. You can read Andrew's 2007 essay, Declaration of Interdependence, Reconciling Profit and Purpose, on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. But for now, that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Brian.
And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network, smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks as always to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh, Managing Director of the impact advisory firm Human Nature. We'll see you next week for more impact.